Lynched on CTV, proudly brought to you by Christchurch's #1 dining offer, Sequoia 88 at the Redwood Hotel, a food concept unequalled. Good evening. They were 2 out of 4 councillors to get re-elected. So how is life after the Parker and Marriott regime, and what are the real challenges inside Grand Central Station on Hereford Street? Tonight, Yanni Johansson and Jamie Goff are my guests, and Lynched starts right now. Good evening, thanks for joining us. Well, there's never been a more important time in the history of this city to take an active interest in its central and local government with the rebuild of our city. Asset sales, infrastructure and investment are just some of the issues facing the council right now. And joining me are Yanni Johansson and Jamie Goff, 2 of the council's youngest councillors. And you wanted me to say that, didn't you, Yanni? So was that right? You're the youngest councillors inside council.
That's right. Jamie's the youngest. I'm the second youngest.
Oh, so very nice. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm glad I've cleared that up. Well, the first story I want to start with is one that's affecting many people, 6,000 of them. That is vulnerable, and I suspect many of these people are elderly residents. These are claimants that still have not had their claims dealt with EQC and insurance companies. This was on the front page of the press last week. I can simply not believe we've still got these people in this city. And my understanding is, Yanni, I'll start with you, there are more and more coming to the woodwork. Why, in your view, is this still happening?
There's one very clear reason why this is still happening, and that is the government's absolute reluctance to get involved in sorting out the insurance and the EQC issues facing our city. I think it's an absolute tragedy that people have been left for so long with so little help and support. This government needs to intervene with the insurers and with EQC to ensure that people's houses are being fixed properly and that they're getting timely and fair settlements, because it is just not acceptable. I was at the Coastal Pathway meeting the other day with, obviously the Prime Minister showing up, and there was a woman outside with letters to Jerry Brownlee, letters to local MPs, letters to EQC, absolutely at her wit's end about any progress to do with her house being rebuilt. And I just think, it is outrageous that nearly 4 years on, people are still in this predicament.
Jamie, is this a government issue or a local issue for Christchurch to sort out, and what possibly more do you think than the government could have done?
I think it's both. I think what makes it an even more bitter pill to swallow is the fact that you've got the likes of insurance companies like IAG, recording absolutely enormous profits. All the while there are these thousands upon thousands of normal people like you and I, the viewers watching this, that are absolutely at their wits' end. And as Yanni quite correctly says, this is 4 years on and it is unacceptable. I think from a central government point of view, I think where a real failure is that there isn't the legislation that a lot of other countries have got, such as Australia, where there are timeframes, there are statutory timeframes, not up in the air sort of touchy-feely type things, that you're breaking the law if you do not have a claim settled by this amount of time. And there are people that have just never gone through anything like this in their lives before, and all of a sudden they've paid for something their entire lives, and they're entitled to receiving a product or service which they have paid for and they haven't received it. So it is completely unacceptable. But it's just so wrong on so many levels. And then going back to the beginning about these record profits, when these people, it's going to the shareholders, but it's not going to the customers and to the people that are really needing it.
And that's a good point, Yanni, because they have made obscene profits. Nothing wrong with a corporate company making money, good on them. But at the same time, though, don't they have a moral obligation to, at least, if they can't pay out, then at least commit to some kind of resolution? Do you think Jerry Brownlee has failed some people of Christchurch by not going to the insurance companies and saying, if you do not solve something with either a resolution or a claimant payout of some sort, you will be penalised?
I think without doubt government have to account for what they haven't done, and that has put the pressure on the insurance companies. But let's talk about the obscene profits that are being made, and let's talk about the government surplus. That is really the story of Christchurch post-earthquake. The government's in surplus on the back of a broken city with broken infrastructure and broken facilities that we cannot afford to fix and that government will not fund. The people's houses are broken because the insurance companies are not putting enough resources into getting them fixed in a timely manner, and they're making profits. So you've got the private sector doing very well, making profits out of people's misery, and you've got the government on the back of a surplus on a broken city, broken streets that are not being fixed, and broken water mains. So I think really, I think it's a story we need to share with the rest of New Zealand and the world, because 4 years on, nearly 4 years on from this major disaster in a modern country like New Zealand, this is completely unacceptable. And the stress and the trauma that people are going through is going to have long-lasting consequences on our city and our society, because the impact on people is at a level that is really unhealthy and is causing a huge amount of pressure.
And I think Yanni's right, because look, there's nothing wrong with businesses doing well. We want businesses to do well, but I think that they need to be holding up their end of the bargain. And where I have the issue is when those businesses aren't actually holding up their obligations. Because if you go along and you buy a coffee and you don't get coffee, well then I certainly wouldn't want that business paying out huge amounts of profits to their shareholders when they can't even deliver on what their core business is. And this is the core business of an insurance company, to provide insurance proceeds at the time that it calls for it. And that's the risk versus reward and the systems that they have in place to be able to deal with a time like this. And they're not delivering on it.
I suspect many of these claimants...
That's the real disaster.
I suspect many of these claimants, or at least nearly 6,000 of them, are possibly elderly people who don't feel the strength or don't have the capability to say, put their hands up and say, I need help. Hasn't EQC failed in a way because they haven't been proactive in knocking on doors and knocking on door campaigns saying, are you okay?
There's something about the New Zealand and the Christchurch psyche where, there's a lot of people that actually suffer in silence because they think someone else is worse off than them. They think that, despite their miserable circumstances, that actually there's people that need help more than they do, and they're reluctant to ask for help. But very clearly, this council, almost 2 years ago, raised this concern with EQC around the need to attend to our most vulnerable first. We passed resolutions, as Jamie will attest, and we have repeatedly asked for an advocacy service to be set up to provide the technical and moral support to people to deal with the insurance companies. Now, I think government could put funding towards the service. They have set up a residential assistance service, but it needs to be well funded, well resourced with technical and legal experts to really stand alongside the people who are the most vulnerable to ensure that they're getting what they're properly entitled to. And I think the concerning thing is people have been so worn out by this insurance and EQC process that they are accepting things that are less than what they should be getting. They are getting houses that are not fixed properly, and that is a real tragedy for our city.
We need to take a break, but from one financial issue to another one, and that is we're trying to find $900 million. How do we do that? That's next. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guests tonight are councillors Yanni Johansson and Jamie Goff. Yanni, I'll start with you. The $900 million shortfall the council faces according to the latest report. What do you see in this and how do we solve the problem?
Well, I think the first thing you have to point out is that the cost share and the blueprint was incredibly unaffordable to us as a city. Now, I personally didn't vote for it. I raised these concerns at the time when we did our 3-year plan and when the council voted on the cost share, because there's no way we could afford to borrow so much money and fund the things that were put in there. But the $900 million is on the assumption that everything in the government's blueprint is done and that the government doesn't contribute more in terms of the infrastructure that we need to fix. Now, I think it's actually really simple. The debate we need to have is not about how do we fund the $900 million shortfall. It's actually what can we afford to do in our city and what can we afford to do in the short term? What is it that we need to do in the short term versus what we want to do in the long term? So I think having a clear vision for the city about where our priorities are and what the values are, and once we've done that, once we've worked out not just a blueprint actually for the central city, but a vision and a strategy for the entire city that includes things like community facilities, includes fixing our broken infrastructure to a modern, resilient standard, then I think we work out how we fund it and over what time frame.
All right, Jamie, so what do you think the priorities for the city should be? Are there any anchor projects you think we should delay, defer, get rid of, burn down?
Look, I think the thing to remember when you talk about priorities is, of course, priorities are going to change. And first and foremost, what the blueprint was a line in the sand. It was about saying we're going to provide some form of confidence. If there is so much uncertainty in this world, and the one thing that we'll try and do is create a framework, because if you don't have investment, you're not going to have a city. So perhaps signalling to say, here's where things are going to go and here are some timeframes around that. Now, of course, priorities change, and the cost share does make provisions for that, which is logical. And luckily, our priorities as a council, or our ideal objective of success in Christchurch being rebuilt, aligns very much with the government.
Because Brownlee told me on Newstalk ZB he will review the cost sharing agreement in December. Why can't he do it now? What's he waiting for?
Well, I do wonder if there may be some sort of impediments and difficulties around the election, and maybe some major, because certainly government's unable to make some major changes or implement major changes before election. I don't know if this falls into that category there. When you talk about priorities and what my priorities are, look, you'll have some, Yanni will have some, I've got some. They're all different. That's fine. But I think the most important thing is if we do reprioritise what's important and what's not, and what can go on the back burner and what we can burn down. Then that's got to be done as a community together.
What about the convention centre? Now that's all up and running, well, so to speak, you've got the government, you've got private investment coming into that now. Is that now a good thing for the city, because the ratepayers can go, thank God we're not paying for this monstrosity?
Yeah, I know you don't like convention centres, but and shoot me down, but I am a fan of it. I do back it. We heard from the business community, both locally and internationally, that one of the first things that you need to be doing if you're going to be setting out what the priorities are going to be and where things are going to be located, that a convention centre is absolutely critical, because as a result of that...
But the odd thing about that, though, we still had no business case for it, though. The people of Christchurch were not offered, right, here's why we need a convention centre, here's the business case, here's how much money it's going to make.
You're absolutely right.
And the economists internationally, on both sides of the political spectrum, have said, actually, conventions are going down worldwide.
You raise a valid point, Chris, and that is, actually, I do want to challenge you, though, that there's no cost to the ratepayer or to the citizen, because 250 million of government funding going into a convention centre is 250 million.
Taxpayer dollars, correct.
That is taxpayer dollars that is not going in to the infrastructure repair. That 250 million is money that is not being allocated towards fixing the broken roads, the broken pipes, the broken water mains. So I think that is an imposed cost on council, because government have not funded their shortfall in terms of what the horizontal infrastructure repairs are needed. Now, the reason that they've delayed it until December 1st, doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out, is because they didn't want that cost coming out before the budget this year, so that they didn't have to account for it. So that is the only reason the government can be in surplus, is because they have not properly accounted for the horizontal infrastructure repairs that they should be committed to, and it's just smokes and mirrors.
Let me get this absolutely clear then. Who is paying for the horizontal infrastructure for the city? Isn't it a combination of the council and...
It's a 60-40 split between the Crown and council.
So council originally had an assessment. We had an assessment of a figure that was about 2.3 billion. The government had a different assessment that said it was about 1.8. There was about a $400 to $500 million difference. The government asked us to take out our assessment out of our budget because they didn't want to account for it in election year. It's as straightforward as that.
Let me pretend to play devil's advocate with you for 1 second. And that is, don't we still need some form of anchor projects in the central city to at least try to attract international investment? Yes, I realise it's failed so far, and it has spectacularly, but aren't we now getting trickles of excitement as a result of the fact that there is some certainty at least?
Yes. Yes, without a shadow of a doubt, it is absolutely critical to be able to attract that investment. And the anchor projects, look, I agree, they're not the be-all and end-all of everything, but one thing that I do have to admit is that it's really easy, and we all are guilty of falling into this trap, where we'll pick things in isolation, or we'll try and make things very black and white, but the recovery is like the legs of a chair. It is utterly critical that we have affordable housing, but there's lots of affordable housing in Gore and a declining population. You can't have affordable housing if you don't have an economy, and you can't have an economy if you don't have culture, and you can't have culture if you don't have... There's so many different facets to what makes a city. So all of those things together create the legs of the chair that actually make that chair stand up and function. And one thing is important, absolutely important, but on its own is irrelevant.
Yeah, is Jamie in a way right what he's suggesting, that you do need one and the other, and there has to be a fine balancing act, because we all admit that some of the roads in this city are stuffed.
Yeah.
But don't we need a fine balancing act to rebuild things at the same time, so there's some kind of vibrancy.
You're absolutely right, Chris. You do need that balance. But a $500 million stadium and a $500 million convention centre, when we've heard that people can't get their roads fixed to a proper standard, and that some of that work may not happen for a long time.
I don't think the stadium's going to happen anytime soon. I think even Canterbury Rugby has accepted that it's a vanity project, haven't they?
If you think about the convention centre, again, what has been the cost to council? We've had to give up the library, which could have been fixed for $8 million to $10 million, and we're now having to build a new $85 million library. That is a huge cost. Gloucester Street has been privatised effectively. It will go into a private development in terms of the convention centre. The public have lost a land in the central city that has now been effectively privatised. So the cost to council is probably close to about $100 million on that convention centre, because we've been unable to fix our existing library. We've had to buy land for a new one and spend the cost of building a new one. So these are huge costs. I think the old council rightfully identified that a convention centre was critical. Probably if the council had been able to get on and do its central city plan, we would have built a modest convention centre, because it was urgent to give the accommodation and the hospitality industry some certainty.
I've only got 30 seconds there, but part of this whole issue that we face with the shortfall is also around insurance. The fact that the council still does not know how much money they are going to get paid out from civic assurance. We're in year 4. That's an absolute disgrace, isn't it? Because until we have certainty from civic assurance, we could be talking about this for years to come and still not have any certainty.
And we're talking about poor Ma and Pa that are going throughout their insurance runaround. Well, take comfort in the fact, Ma and Pa, that council's in the same position. So we're banging our heads against the wall as well. You're right, though, it is potential shortfalls. One position that we are in, though, and to be very clear, is our balance sheet is a strong one. We do have options. The task is difficult, but it's not impossible, and we will get there.
Excellent segue, because I want to discuss some of those options next. Are asset sales the only options to get us back into the good books financially? That's next. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest tonight is Jamie Goff and Yanni Johansson. Jamie, in terms of the council financial black hole, is one way to achieve financial certainty is by selling off some of our assets, partially at least. What do you see in this?
Yeah, absolutely right. It certainly is an option. And I think, when you were talking about prioritisation of things, you're talking about the stadium. Is it something that could be reprioritised? Yeah, absolutely. Potentially quite likely. But it's exactly the same with asset sales or potential asset sales. So there are a whole host of options that we have in front of us, because, as I was saying just before the break, our balance sheet is a strong one. We have a real challenge ahead of us. I think everyone gets that. Everyone gets that it's a big challenge. But out of all the councils who are going to be well equipped to deal with it, Christchurch is actually in a really good place. We didn't hock off all the council-controlled organisations like a lot of other councils did, and if we had, we'd be right up the alley without a paddle. We're up the creek right now, but we do have a paddle, so that gives some comfort. Yes, their asset sales are always a potential. Potentially rate rises. Don't like the idea of that at all, but everything needs to be considered, and if for every asset that you don't sell potentially, then that needs to be covered up, covered off from somewhere, and it may mean that the asset, if the asset sale doesn't go ahead, then it will be that rate rises increase further, and that's a conversation that we have to have with the community.
Nobody is going to want that, and Leanne Dalzell was on this program recently saying it's not just either a rate rise or asset sale argument.
Or a combination.
But isn't it really, though, Yanni, what are the other options if people are strongly against asset sales, and I feel that many people will be, but I could be wrong, we don't want another rate rise. We can't afford it.
You've got 4 options.
So what are the other options then, do you think?
So you have to work out actually what you want to spend the money on.
Borrow more, spend less, sell stuff or raise rates.
And that should really dictate
it's not rocket science.
How much. And what you need to work backwards is to say, well, this is what we want to do. How can we do it? What we're going in with is, here's what the government is saying we have to do, and we don't have any choice, and so that's at $900 million. Now, clearly, the first option is to ask government to pay the fair share of the costs that they've imposed on us as a city. And clearly, that is not being done at the moment. So I think that's the first thing. But putting that to one side...
So one option is to say, hey, John, can you flick us some more cash, please, so we don't have to start selling off our assets?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the government have always wanted, this government have been really keen on asset sales. You can see that with what they've done nationally, and you can see that in some of the early pressure they were putting on council. Now, it was really interesting when the blueprint came out, when Council's Central City plan came out, the Minister for Earthquake Recovery was quoted as saying it's a pretty big wish list and it's now up to the people of Christchurch to determine what they want to pay for. Well, unfortunately, the people of Christchurch never had that chance because the government came in and imposed a blueprint on the city that was not funded, that they had no idea how it was going to be funded, and imposed a huge cost. So what we need to do now is engage with our community over what the priorities should be. We need to actually talk to government around what some of the options are. And I think actually the question is not about either putting up rates or selling off assets. It's what can we afford to do as a city and over what time frame? What do we need to do on the short term?
And that's simply the third option, which
and
is
what do we
spend
do
less
on the
money.
long term? So it might be for our infrastructure repairs, for example, that there's things that we can delay, but we do it over a longer period of time than the 5-year program that government and council have currently got in place.
And you know what? That's not a silly thing though, Yanni, because the rebuild isn't necessarily sustainable. If you do everything in 3 to 4 years,
let me just give you some examples of what's happening now that is
view.
costing us a huge amount of money that we do not have. Right? You look at the accessible transport plan, the Central City plan. It is not aligned to the skirt repairs. So most of the Central City will be fixed ahead of the master plan for the Central City, which means we will have to come back later with additional money, dig up the same roads that we've just fixed and do them in a different way. Otherwise, the Central City Transport Plan will not work. It seems crazy to me that we do not have alignment and we are spending twice as much as we need to because we don't have that synergy behind the infrastructure repair and the master plan. So there are ways of dealing with these funding pressures.
Say the government doesn't come to the party with more cash, because that's probably is one option though.
Yes.
Say the government says, no, we've signed this, and they well could say that we've signed it, it's sealed, delivered, whatever, we're not going to do anything now. Then your only option could be, though, realistically, is partial asset sales or rates. If you had to choose one or the other, what would it be, Yanni?
No, well, I don't think that's a fair question, Chris. I think at the end of the day, we need to understand what the financial picture is, and we're not going to be able to do that until our insurance settlement is sorted, and in terms of the horizontal infrastructure review, which is due by December 1st,
do you know what, Yanni? So what is a fair thing
we
to
will
say
go through.
on this,
Can I just finish, Jamie?
Right.
We will go through and engage, and I think it's really good that this council has said what's really important is we engage with our community about what the different trade-offs are. Because to me, it makes no sense to sell off assets that make money to put into assets that lose money.
Does it make sense to rise rates, though, increase rates? Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think we are going to need to look at increasing rates. It's obviously something that, regardless of whatever situation we're faced with, the reality is that our rates are one option which can help fund for some of the things that we need to do.
Jamie, can you respond?
Yeah,
we're running out of time.
The thing is here that you've also got a whole new class of people which are the working poor, and they're the people, again, exactly like you and I and the people that are watching the show right now, that have never asked for a handout in their entire lives. They've worked bloody hard, and all of a sudden, through no fault of their own, in the worst possible dire situation, and just do not have the money to be able to really live anymore. And these are just average, everyday people, and that is not on. So no, I don't believe that we can be looking at rates and saying, oh, we'll just keep raising rates and we'll just keep raising them some more, because this also compiles. So a 7% rate rise last year then goes back to zero. So
and it's not the only option. Let's be clear about that.
No, you're right. But I think what is a fair assertion is that there is going to be a financial hole. Fact. So how the heck are you going to fill it? And I think there are a range of things. What were strategic assets once may not be today. Post-earthquake, the world got turned upside down. What might have been a strategic asset pre-earthquake may well not be strategic nowadays going forward. A contracting company, is it a strategic asset? I don't know. Bus companies, who knows? Now the thing is, that's where Yanni is right, because you'll have a conversation with the community, we'll say, here's the hole that we need to fill, how would you like that to be done? And if you want to pay 50% increases in your rates, but hang on to City Care or Redbus, well then so be it.
And the most important thing is that as
I don't think that's a smart thing to do though.
We're open and transparent with our community about what the choices are that we have, and we talk to them and we seek their feedback over the way forward, and I think that's really important.
We're nearly out of time. I've got 30 seconds left. Just want to very briefly ask you 10 seconds to answer this, please. In this time, in 3 years' time, what and where will we be in terms of Christchurch City? Jamie?
Look, I think in 3 years' time we're going to be have some financial certainty. I think that we're probably going to have a number of these anchor projects going along. Hopefully, Uncle Anthony's got the terrace going, and we can go down and have a cold one there.
Uncle Anthony.
But look, I think we're going to be in a lot better space. I feel that there is a wind of change, and I feel the positivity. I'm still excited to be in Christchurch, and it's getting better each day. But I hope a lot of the stuff that we've talked about is most well and truly in the past.
Yanni.
Yeah, I think what we'll see is that we'll still see slow progress. I'm hopeful that we can get more things happening. I think the exciting things will be to look at what's happening with the adventure park up on the Cashmere Hills, what's happening with things like the coastal pathway and the cycleways, and I'm really hopeful that we can have a really fun city that ties in with a sense of sustainable and environmentally friendly activities where people can go and have fun and recreate. So I think we're at a crossroads. We have some big choices to make about what we can fund and how we can afford it, but really we need to focus on providing a city that still maintains its quality of life.
We're out of time. Yanni Hansen and Jamie Goff, thanks for joining me on Lynched tonight. Appreciate your time. Nice to speak with you both.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
That's our show. We'll see you next week. Lynched on CTV was proudly brought to you by Christchurch's #1 dining offer, Sequoia 88, at the Redwood Hotel, a food concept unequalled.